There. I'm Dr. Diane Groat. I am a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor of psychology at Jackson State University in the US. And I've been working on some research with my research assistants, Shane Weld and Caleb Cawthon, who will be authors on this study. But I am presenting a preliminary data analysis of our research on the impact of COVID-19 on undergraduate stress and mental health in US undergraduates. I don't want you there. The research shows that there are a lot of factors that influence a student's academic performance. I can tell from listening to these presentations that you guys would be familiar with some of this research. We know that there are external and internal factors that impact stress levels. And we know that some of the intrapersonal factors include self-esteem and coping styles. And these play a key role in how stress is managed. Now, since the onset of COVID-19 in 2020, university students have been dealing with multiple sources of new stress while engaging in college courses. A recent study published this year indicated that students reported significant increases in their academic stress levels and mental health symptoms since COVID-19. And that study was conducted in Africa. My current study is an examination of the factors associated with COVID-19 experiences and how intrapersonal variables influence academic stress and mental health in a group of US undergraduate students. Information from this study will hopefully assist university students, faculty, university counseling centers, and administrators in understanding the current situation and developing approaches to ameliorate the effects of in the university setting. This is the model based on a couple of theories. We use this model to explore how these variables interacted. As I said earlier, we have seen in the literature that external factors play an important role in people's outcomes in terms of mental health and academic stress. And so specifically, we looked at the external variables related to COVID and things like whether the person or family had experienced COVID-19 and whether they had had a family member or friend die as a result of COVID-19. Also looked at how COVID impacted their academic career in terms of having to suddenly shift online, impact on their grades, whether it changed the amount of courses they were taking, things like that. And also looked at the employment impact, because many of our college students work in industries that are direct service providers, and those closed down when we were in our restricted stages. And looked at how these things impacted the internal factors of self-esteem and coping style. This model is going to be analyzed in a path analysis, and that path analysis is going to look at how these things contribute to self-esteem in a global sense, and how self-esteem and coping style interact or co-vary with each other, and how this is interacting and affecting their mental health symptoms and various domains of academic stress. The external factors were assessed using a COVID questionnaire that I developed. Coping style was assessed using the brief COPE, which gives us 3 domains in analyzing the data of avoidant, emotion-focused, or problem-focused coping strategies, plus an overall coping measure. And academic stress used the perceived academic stress scale. and it has 4 components plus a total score that we looked at. Measured self-esteem with the Rosenberg Self Efficacy Scale, and used the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale called the DASS to measure mental health outcomes. It measures symptoms, but it doesn't diagnose. And what we were looking at was the depletion of the resources that self-efficacy gives people in coping with stress. And the fact that as our stress level continues and increases, and especially if it becomes cumulative with a lot of experiences of COVID and a lot of impacts of COVID, that our ability to cope starts to deteriorate, and over time, our resources that allow us to manage these stresses effectively begin to fail. And that failure is going to affect mental health symptoms. We anticipate that they would escalate, and also it's going to affect their reports of academic stress. But while their self-esteem or self-efficacy is at a higher level, we predict that they will have less mental health symptoms and that they'll be able to manage the stresses in the academic setting effectively using the resource of their self-efficacy. Now, it's just a cute little map I made. We collected the longitude and latitude of an anonymous survey and showed that our participants were scattered throughout the United States. And we limited our group to 18 to 30-year-old. And we studied this in the United States exclusively for multiple reasons, but one of which was because the perceived academic stress scale that was developed in Asia and tested in various parts of Asia, India, and Africa doesn't seem to have been used in the United States. So I wanted to compare American students to students in other continents and see what the differences might be in terms of perceived academic stress. Now, these are just some of my findings of the basic data analysis that we did, looked at correlations using a Pearson correlation model, and found that self-esteem was significantly correlated with all the variables associated with mental health symptoms, academic stress, and coping strategies examined in this study. However, when we looked at these individual scales, what we found is that the coping strategies and the total coping scale were all highly significant in their relationship with self-esteem, in that they were at a significance level of 0.000, which kind of startled me for 119 subjects. And what this suggests is that higher self-esteem is associated with less use of these coping strategies, because the questions ask, hey, when you were under stress, how did you handle it? Did you make jokes about it? Did you try to avoid it? Did you try to find a solution to it? And people in our study with higher self-esteem reported less use of all these skills. And so that suggests that our hypothesis that stress is moderated by self-esteem and that this affects the use of coping strategies found a little support. We also found that high self-esteem is associated with self-efficacy beliefs. And so there's less need for coping strategies, even though you're experiencing higher levels of stress. And you can see the different types of coping strategies from this brief cope measure. And it was interesting that they're all about equal in their relationship. So they're all pretty strong in their relationship to self-esteem. And it seems to be a pretty strong result for that particular question. We also looked at how self-esteem is associated with mental health symptoms. Self-esteem has a strong positive association with stress at a 0.001 level or less than 0.001. and it had a moderate relationship with anxiety, and it had a weak but still significant relationship with depression, and the probability level for that is 0.018, and the correlation is R216, so it is kind of weak, but it still existed. Now, this related to our hypothesis that the interaction between self-esteem and environmental stressors, in this case, COVID experiences, would show this kind of interaction, and that the resource depletion theory or conservation of resources theory, whichever you refer to it as, of stress and coping would show that this self-esteem interaction with mental health symptoms predicted the ways in which self-esteem would act as a buffer for people's mental health, and that as these resources depleted, what we're going to see is lower self-esteem is going to be related to higher levels of these mental health symptoms. We also looked directly at the relationship between self-esteem and academic stress, and it was found to have a strong positive relationship with all components of academic stress assessed in this study. And the relationships range from a 0.481 for academic self-perception to a 0.667 for pressure to perform. Pressure to perform turned out also to have some significant relationships with some of the stress and anxiety, but I won't get a time to go into that, so I didn't include that in here. But it's important to note that self-esteem has a very reliable prediction here at a 0.001. And so this shows that our hypothesis that self-esteem and students' perceptions of academic stress are related, but we'll be doing further investigation of that using a multiple regression analysis and a path analysis. And the perceived academic stress scale has planned analysis with exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis to see if the data on these 4 factors is consistent in a US population like it was in the previous. Just a couple of quick things about demographics. We found that gender was highly associated with stress, problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, avoidant coping, and the total cope scale. Now, we used an ANOVA for this, as you can see from the F scores, and all of these results except avoidant were pretty strong. Avoidant is only 0.049, so it's just barely valid, but still present. Race and ethnicity showed a significant mean difference on most of the components of academic stress, from pressure to perform, which is 0.051. Again, it's barely significant, to things like academic workload, time restraints, and the total score, which had higher significance. Only academic self-perception was non-significant based on race and ethnicity. Age wasn't found to have any significant relationship with any of the variables that we investigated. And when we looked at demographics and COVID-19 impacts, we found that academic impacts showed a mean difference for gender. And those impacts included a sudden switch to online classes, impact on grades and course loads, and unexpected unemployment. We also found a mean difference for race and ethnicity, and COVID-19 experiences of death of family members. And that was significant at a 0.005 level. And lastly, we found that age had a highly significant negative association with both COVID-19 personal experiences, and that would mean having COVID, testing positive for COVID, being hospitalized for COVID, and COVID-19 deaths of friends and family members, and the academic impacts. And all of these were significant at a 0.001 level. And interpreting this indicated that participants in a younger age group reported more of these types of experiences than the older age group of our participants. I thank you very much for your attention and for listening to my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time.